Imagine buying a Peugeot 205 for £25,000. Sounds ridiculous, and most people would have thought you'd lost your mind. But then, 40 years later, it turned out to be worth more than a Ferrari. But during the madness of Group B rallying, manufacturers built road cars so extreme, so unnecessary, and so completely unhinged that collectors now treat them like automotive gold. A Metro became a six-figure investment. A Peugeot became a £250,000 icon, and a Lancia became a £1 million obsession. This is the story of how some of the cheapest family cars of the 1980s became some of the most expensive road cars on Earth. But there's more. Can you spot the error we deliberately put in the video? Let us know. This is Four Wheels and Fuel. Here we go. Peugeot 205 T16. The Peugeot 205 T16 exists because somebody discovered a loophole and then decided to drive a rally car straight through it. Because in 1986, a normal Peugeot 205 was one of the most sensible cars you could buy. It cost about £4,000, sipped fuel, fitted neatly into supermarket car parks, and spent its life carrying families, shopping bags, and occasionally a dog that wasn't particularly interested in motoring. It was ordinary, painfully ordinary, which makes what happened next completely ridiculous. You see, Group B rallying required manufacturers to build road-going versions of their competition cars. The idea was simple. If you wanted to race something, you had to sell a certain number to the public. Most manufacturers treated this as an inconvenience. Peugeot treated it as an opportunity. So while the standard 205 carried its engine at the front and drove the front wheels, like every sensible hatchback of the period, the 205 T16 arrived with the engine mounted behind the seats and power going to all four wheels. At that point, it wasn't really a 205 anymore. It was a rally car wearing a 205 costume, and a very convincing costume at that. From the front, it still looked vaguely familiar. But then you noticed the swollen wheel arches, the massive air intakes, the wider stance, and the fact that the entire thing appeared to have spent 6 months lifting weights. This wasn't a hot hatch. This was a homologation special built with one purpose: winning rallies. Then you looked underneath. The engine was a turbocharged 1.8-litre four-cylinder, producing 197 brake horsepower and 255 Newton-meters of torque. That may not sound outrageous today, but remember, this was 1986. Most family hatchbacks struggled to produce half that figure. And the Peugeot weighed only 1,145 kilograms. The result was astonishing. 0 to 60 miles per hour took 5.8 seconds. Top speed stood at 130 miles per hour, and the fuel economy was 23 miles per gallon. Again, this was a car based on something your accountant might have driven to work. The truly impressive part wasn't the straight-line speed, it was the grip. The four-wheel drive system gave the T16 enormous traction, allowing it to deploy its power in conditions that would leave many sports cars desperately searching for grip. Wet roads, loose surfaces, tight corners, it simply attacked everything with ruthless efficiency. Which explains why the competition version went on to dominate the World Rally Championship. The road car was effectively a ticket into that world, and buyers knew it. The ordinary Peugeot 205 cost £4,000. The 205 T16 cost £25,000. 6 times more money for a car that shared little more than its badge and basic silhouette with the family hatchback parked outside. At the time, many people thought Peugeot had completely lost its mind. Today, collectors think Peugeot was offering a bargain. Because modern values now range from £180,000 to more than £300,000. Which means one of the most valuable French performance cars ever built started life as a humble family hatchback. And honestly, that's exactly the sort of madness Group B encouraged. If you enjoy the stories on Four Wheels and Fuel, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee. Just click on the link or scan the QR code. It helps keep these nostalgic car stories alive. Let's continue. MG Metro 6R4 Clubman. The Metro 6R4 is one of the greatest examples of Britain collectively losing its mind. Because this story starts with a car that was never supposed to be exciting. The ordinary Metro was basic transportation. In 1986, a standard Metro cost about £4,000. It was small, economical, and designed for people whose automotive ambitions extended no further than getting to work without incident. Nobody looked at a Metro and thought, you know what this needs? A racing-derived V6 mounted behind the seats. But somebody at Austin Rover did. And somehow they convinced everybody else. The result was the Metro 6R4, a car that shared its basic silhouette with the ordinary Metro and almost nothing else. Underneath sat an entirely different machine, built for one purpose: satisfying Group B homologation rules while terrifying anyone brave enough to drive it properly. The name itself sounded technical enough. 6R4 stood for 6 cylinders, rally, and four-wheel drive. Simple. What wasn't simple was the engineering. Unlike most of its Group B rivals, the Metro didn't rely on turbochargers. Instead, it used a naturally aspirated 3-litre V6 developed specifically for the project. While competitors were busy waiting for turbo boost to arrive like an overdue parcel, the Metro simply delivered power immediately. All 250 brake horsepower of it. And in a car weighing just 1,040 kilograms, that was more than enough. The numbers were extraordinary for something that looked like a shopping trolley. 0 to 60 miles per hour took 4.5 seconds. Top speed stood at 115 miles per hour. Fuel economy was around 10 miles per gallon, although anyone driving a 6R4 enthusiastically probably regarded fuel stations as regular checkpoints rather than destinations. The real shock came from the way it looked, because unlike the elegant Peugeot, the Metro appeared completely unhinged. The wheel arches were enormous. The stance was absurdly wide. Air intakes appeared everywhere. It looked less like a family hatchback and more like a family hatchback that had spent 6 months taking performance-enhancing drugs. And people loved it. This was Britain's answer to Group B. Loud, aggressive, slightly ridiculous, and impossible to ignore. Then everything changed. In 1986, a series of fatal accidents brought Group B rallying to an abrupt end. The category was cancelled. The future these cars had been built for disappeared almost overnight. And suddenly, the Metro 6R4 found itself in a very strange position. Austin Rover had planned for a rallying future. Instead, it inherited a warehouse full of road cars nobody quite knew what to do with. The original asking price had been £45,000. Then reality arrived. With Group B dead, prices collapsed. Some cars were reportedly sold for as little as £16,000, simply to move them on. Imagine that for a moment. A hand-built, four-wheel drive rally homologation special selling for less than half its original price. Today, collectors probably wish they had bought 10. Because modern values now sit between £180,000 and £280,000. Not bad for a car based on a Metro. And that's what makes the 6R4 so brilliant. It may be the only vehicle in history to evolve from cheap city car to six-figure collector's item without ever becoming remotely sensible in between. If giant American V8s, enough torque to rearrange continents, and tyre smoke visible from orbit sound more entertaining, check out 4 Wheels and Fuel USA after the video. Link is in the description. Ford RS 200. Most homologation specials started with an ordinary road car. The Peugeot came from a 205. The Metro came from a Metro. The Lancia came from a Delta. The Ford RS 200 came from absolutely nothing. Because Ford looked at the Group B rulebook, looked at its existing showroom range, and decided none of it was remotely suitable. So instead of modifying a family hatchback, Ford did something much more expensive. It started from scratch. And that immediately made the RS 200 different from almost everything else in the category. This wasn't a road car adapted for rallying. It was a rally car adapted for the road. The project was developed with input from Gear, while the chassis was designed by renowned Formula One engineer Tony Southgate. Even by Group B standards, the engineering was ambitious. A lightweight composite body sat over a purpose-built space-frame chassis. The engine was mounted behind the seats. Four-wheel drive handled traction duties. Everything about the car existed for performance. The remarkable thing is how affordable it seemed at the time, or at least affordable by Group B standards. In 1986, a Ford RS 200 cost £49,950. That's double the money to a Peugeot 205 T16. Yet, unlike the Peugeot, there wasn't a £4,000 family hatchback sitting underneath. Every RS 200 was effectively its own bespoke machine, and you could see where the money went. The proportions were pure exotic car. The cabin sat far forward. The bodywork wrapped tightly around the chassis. Air intakes and vents appeared wherever engineers thought they might help. It looked less like something from a Ford showroom and more like a prototype that had accidentally escaped onto public roads. Then you drove it, and suddenly the madness made sense. Mounted behind the cockpit sat a turbocharged 1.8-litre engine producing 250 brake horsepower and 291 Newton-meters. That power went through all four wheels, allowing the RS200 to launch itself towards the horizon with alarming efficiency. 0 to 60 miles per hour took just 5 seconds. The top speed stood at 140 miles per hour, and the fuel economy came in at 20 miles per gallon. Those numbers still sound respectable today. In 1986, they bordered on the absurd. And unlike some Group B machinery, the RS200 had a reputation for being surprisingly approachable. The chassis was balanced, the steering precise, and the four-wheel drive system gave drivers confidence that many rival cars struggled to provide. Which was fortunate, because Group B machinery had developed a habit of punishing mistakes with considerable enthusiasm. The tragedy for Ford was timing. After years of development and enormous investment, the RS200 arrived just as Group B was approaching its end. The category was cancelled, the future disappeared, and Ford suddenly found itself with one of the most advanced performance cars in the world and nowhere meaningful to race it. That should have made the RS200 a failure. Instead, it became a legend. Collectors eventually realized what Ford had actually built. Not a modified hatchback, not a marketing exercise. A genuine, purpose-built homologation special created during the most outrageous period in rally history. Which explains why modern values now range from £250,000 to more than £500,000. Not bad for a Ford. And yet somehow the next car makes even that look sensible. The really frightening thing about the RS200 is that it wasn't even the most extreme road car Group B created. For that, we need to visit Italy, and things are about to get completely ridiculous. Lancia Delta S4 Stradale. If the Peugeot was clever, the Metro was insane, and the Ford was ambitious. The Lancia Delta S4 was what happened when engineers stopped caring about consequences altogether. Because by the middle of the 1980s, Group B had become an arms race. Manufacturers weren't trying to build the best rally cars anymore. They were trying to build the most outrageous ones. And nobody embraced that philosophy more enthusiastically than Lancia, which makes the Delta S4 one of the most misleading names in automotive history. Because despite the badge, this wasn't really a Delta. A normal Lancia Delta cost about £8,000 in 1986. It was a sensible family hatchback, practical, comfortable, entirely harmless. The Delta S4 shared little more than the general idea of being a car. Underneath sat a tubular space frame chassis. The engine was mounted behind the seats. Four-wheel drive sent power to all four corners. Composite body panels covered mechanical components that looked more at home in a rally service park than a dealership showroom. And then there was the engine, because somebody at Lancia looked at turbocharging and decided it wasn't enough. Most manufacturers were using a turbocharger. Lancia used a turbocharger and a supercharger at the same time. The system became known as twin charging, and it remains one of the most gloriously overcomplicated solutions ever fitted to a production car. The supercharger eliminated low RPM lag. The turbocharger took over at higher speeds. Together they delivered relentless acceleration throughout the rev range. It was brilliant. It was expensive. And it was completely mad. The road-going Delta S4 Stradale produced 250 brake horsepower and 291 Newton-meters from just 1.8 litres. In a machine weighing around 1,200 kilograms, that translated into genuinely supercar performance. 0 to 60 miles per hour took 5.7 seconds. Top speed reached 140 miles per hour, while the fuel economy stood at 18 miles per gallon, which, frankly, was the least surprising figure on the entire spec sheet. What made the S4 special wasn't simply speed. It was the feeling that nobody had told the engineers when to stop. Everything about the car felt extreme. The drivetrain, the chassis, the engine. Because buyers understood they weren't purchasing transport. They were buying a piece of Group B history while Group B was still happening. Then the category collapsed. A series of fatal accidents brought the era to an abrupt end, freezing cars like the S4 in time. They immediately became symbols of a period many still regard as the most spectacular and dangerous chapter motorsport has ever produced. And that brings us to the final twist. Today, a Delta S4 Stradale is worth between £500,000 and well over £1 million. Think about that for a second. A car based on a family hatchback now trades hands for hypercar money. Not because it was practical, not because it was reliable, not because it made financial sense, but because it represents the exact moment motorsport disappeared completely over the horizon and took common sense with it. So, what have we learned? In 1986, these cars looked absurdly expensive. Today, they make Ferraris look like sensible investments. A Peugeot worth £250,000. A Metro worth more than most houses. A Ford built purely because common sense had left the building. And a Lancia that now changes hands for the sort of money normally associated with yachts and bad financial decisions. Looking back, which Group B homologation special would you have bought knowing what they're worth today? Did you enjoy the story? The Buy Me a Coffee link is in the description. It will help us a lot. And on that bombshell, this is Four Wheels and Fuel. See you next time.